Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at the design argument from Aquinas, look at Paley, and then look at the several challenges that you can get asked for. These 5 things are named on your specification, so that means that they can ask you a 25-mark question on them. So in a teleological argument or design argument introduction, you need to discuss that it's an inductive argument, so that means it brings about a probable rather than a necessary conclusion. So the strength of the argument is on how persuasive the premises are to bring you to that probable conclusion. And it's an a posteriori argument because it's post-experience of the world, and what it's post-experience of is the apparent purpose or telos or end in the world, so things appear to have been designed or put in place for a specific purpose. So the first design argument that we're going to look at is Aquinas' 5th way of the 5 ways of the Summa Theologica. This one is very much based on reflecting on nature and the order that nature has, and the fact that nature seems to follow certain natural laws. We can see that Aristotle is an influence here, as ever in Aquinas' work, and the idea that things are being driven and put into an order by a final cause, very much like his prime mover. Now, Aquinas uses an example of an archer shooting an arrow. Now, the arrow is an inanimate object which is not intelligent. And the only way that the arrow can find its target and has some kind of goal and direction is that something with intelligence, the archer, drives it towards that goal, gives it its purpose. So he says, if we look at the world, there are lots of things which are inanimate objects, which lack intelligence, which have a goal, have an end result. So if we think about the planets in their orbit, there's no way that they could have put themselves into that orbit and to have that goal and direction. So therefore, there must be something with intelligence that does that. And he would argue that that is God. Now, I think in Aquinas' own words, this is completely accessible for you to have a look at. So he argues, we see things which lack knowledge, such as natural bodies, and by that he means planets. They act for an end, and this is evident from them acting always in the same way. So if we think about those planets orbiting, hence it is plain that they achieve their end, not fortuitously, so that doesn't mean just by accident that it happens to just work, but designedly. Now, whatever lacks knowledge cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, and this being we call God. Now, as ever, whenever a philosopher uses an analogy, you can always raise the question, does this analogy work? Is the world and the universe like an archer and an arrow? Is it fair to compare the two? Now, a more famous design argument is that of William Paley. Now, it's absolutely crucial that you are clear that William Paley is writing after Hume. So you will have to discuss how Hume criticizes design arguments, and it's really important that you say Hume is criticizing arguments like Paley, where an analogy is drawn between the universe or the world and a machine. So what we've got to think about is Paley is writing after Hume, knowing what Hume says. And so that's why his argument actually has more to it than just the watchmaker and the story of walking along a heath. So Paley tells in his book Natural Theology, suppose you're walking along a heath and you come across a rock, you would look at the rock and you would just suppose it's always been there. Nothing of it really sort of makes you think any further. Whereas if you found a watch, even if you hadn't seen a watch before, you would look at it and you would open it up and you see all the cogs and springs and the mechanism, and you would think that this couldn't have come about by chance. These things must have been placed in a specific order for the purpose of telling the time. And he would argue that if you look at the world and biological systems like the human eye, that they too have this same kind of complexity in parts that appear to have been arranged for a specific purpose. And if we needed a watchmaker in case of the watch, we therefore must have a divine watchmaker or a divine designer of the universe, and that is God. He then has the second part of the argument, which a lot of candidates forget to discuss, which is then suppose you saw that the watch was able to duplicate itself and produce more watches, you would then have more admiration for the intelligence of the designer. And I think what he's doing here is drawing the comparison between the universe in that the universe isn't a complete design. The universe has systems within it which are able to reproduce itself. So like us, animals, plants, all of the living things are able to continue and reproduce itself. So if we saw a watch reproducing itself, we would think this is an amazing design. The intelligence of the designer is extraordinary. So if we can see natural things in our world that are also able to reproduce, then why would we not have this great admiration for the designer of this world? We can also see how Paley is writing post-Hume. So he also forms part of his argument by trying to persuade us with having other additional elements that can answer some of Hume's criticisms. So he says even if the watch didn't work completely correctly, there would still be a sufficient amount of design, even if it wasn't completely functioning perfectly, to suppose there was a designer. He also says even if you didn't know exactly how the watch worked or you couldn't observe all of the parts of the watch, you would still think that there was sufficient amount of design. So that's kind of answering how we don't even fully understand how the universe works and how the world works, but there's still a sufficient amount of design. And he also is quite critical, and he says we can't be satisfied by just saying that the watch came about through some kind of law of mechanics or law of watch. We would have to say that it kind of just produced itself. There must have been a designer. So in the same way, we can't just say that the world's parts all came together by chance or through some natural generation. There must have been a designer. We wouldn't be satisfied to say that the watch came about by chance and it just made itself, or that it just chance arranged the parts so that it functioned. So if we wouldn't be satisfied for that as an explanation of the watch, we also shouldn't be satisfied as that as an explanation of the universe. Now, Swinburne would agree with Paley, and he would argue that the analogy of of animals or the universe to machinery is correct and is justified. So you can use Swinburne to back up Paley. You can argue against the design argument using Darwin's theory of evolution. That's actually on the specification for you to be able to do that. And the reason why is because the process of natural selection could be the alternative explanation as to why we have complex things which are able to function. Now, you can use F.R. Tennant's anthropic principle as a way of criticising the theory of evolution, because Tennant argues that actually evidence of evolution is just further evidence of God's design and how amazing this design was, that something like all of the different species were able to evolve, but aimed at resulting in humans. So anthro means human. So if you ever see that term anthro, a bit like anthropomorphizing, that's talking about humans. So anthropic principle is the principle that the whole of evolution, the whole of the universe is pointed towards humanity. Archbishop Temple also says the doctrine of evolution leaves the argument for an intelligent creator and governor of the earth stronger than it was before. So these are quite useful in a part B to show that actually evolution doesn't necessarily challenge a design. It can be the way that actually God designed the world. Now, I think another question that you could raise is, do we just look at order and purpose and the appearance of design as a sort of habit of mind, that we like the idea of purpose and we like the idea that things are designed and that's what we experience every day? But just because we like the idea that there's a purpose and we see order doesn't mean that there is, and doesn't mean therefore that there is a designer of it. So it's come up once before, fairly recently, but it could come up again, and also you need him for your part Bs, is how Hume evaluates the design argument. Now, he has a huge issue with the analogy of the world to a machine, and he says that this analogy is unsound. He says, well, first of all, if we're going to draw an analogy, why do we not draw an analogy of the world with something which is of this world? So, for example, like a carrot. Actually, a carrot seems to be more similar to the world. It grows, it's natural, whereas a watch or a machine is man-made. Well, the reason why people don't use these analogies is if I look at a carrot or something natural, I don't necessarily think there has to be a designer. Whereas if I look at machine, I think, oh yeah, there is a designer, so it's going to be more persuasive. He also argues that you can't go from a seen effect to an unseen cause. So, for example, if I was going to cover up this pan of this scale, okay, now I can't see what's causing this scale to be either up or down, the other pan in a scale. So I've got a seen effect. I can see that this scale is maybe slightly tipped downwards, but I can't see what's causing it. It could be an elephant with his tiptoe on it, it could be a pound of strawberries, it could be a ton of feathers, I don't know. So in the same way, I'm going from a seen effect, looking at apparent order and design in the universe and saying that must be a God. But I can't see the cause. I can see the effect, but I can't see the cause. So how can we go from a seen effect to an unseen cause? The cause could be anything, and that kind of links to some of the criticisms that we're going to look at next. Now, the other famous criticism he has is the Epicurean thesis. So the Epicurean thesis is that if you had infinite time, there are an infinite combination of particles or things that could have happened. So, of course, within infinite time and in infinite combinations, you're going to get a combination that would work. So just because we have a combination of the world, like the distance from the sun, etc., that works, doesn't mean it's been designed. It could be the result of an infinite combination of things where there's thousands different combinations that didn't work. We just happened to be in a combination that did. And the famous example to explain an Epicurean thesis, which wasn't Hume, but you can use it, is that if you had a room full of monkeys at a typewriter in infinite time, they would eventually write the entire Bible, the entire works of Shakespeare. So in infinite time, there will be a combination which works, which appears to have order. So linking to the one with the scale and the pan, seeing a pan up or a pan down of a scale, and the idea that you can't go from a seen effect to an unseen cause, you can then ask the question, why does the designer have to be God? It could be a league of angels, an infant God, a God that's not very nice, a God who created the world and ran away. So even if there is a designer, remember it's an inductive argument which is leading to a probable conclusion, there might be an alternative conclusion. Why does the designer have to be the Christian God? And also, if effects resemble their causes, well, this world is limited. This world has beginning and an end. So why is the cause not similar to that? There's also another analogy of the architect and the builder. So if we see a house being built, we would think that maybe there was a team of builders. You also have an architect, and we can kind of observe that, but we can't do the same thing with our world. And also, if the house was faulty and there were problems with the design, we would also suggest that maybe there was a problem with the designer or the builders. So when we look at the world and we see things like natural evil and tornadoes and earthquakes, surely that would suggest that the designer is at fault. The other critic you have to be aware is John Stuart Mill. This has come up twice as a Part A explained question, so it potentially could be unlikely that it will come up again on its own, but as ever with OCR, you cannot be absolutely sure, so you need to be prepared for it. He's also very, very useful for a Part B, and you could get it as a Part B. To what extent is John Stuart Mill successful in his criticism of the design argument, for example? Now, John Stuart Mill is criticising it from a problem of evil standpoint, and he says, well, if we look at the nature of the design of the universe, if there was a designer, this designer seems to be cruel, seems to be malicious. What nature does, humans would get locked up for. If we kill someone, if we murder someone, if we torture them, cause suffering, we are imprisoned for it. And he argues that nature does this every day. It's nature's everyday performance, and it's cruel. So, for example, if we look at how animals kill one another for food, they don't just kill one another, they rip one another to pieces. They cause tremendous suffering. And he says, how could this be the result of a good, benevolent designer? So in the part B, what you are going to be weighing up is how successful are Paley and Aquinas in suggesting that there must be a designer, something which intelligence is the reason why there is order and purpose in the world, weighing up with the criticisms on the other side. Now, what's quite useful is you can use F.R. Tenon to be a counter challenge to evolution. You could use your theodicy work to respond potentially to Mill as to why there maybe has to be cruelty in nature. That comes around. Augustine, for example, would say that it's a result of the disharmony brought about by Adam and Eve. You could say, using the Irenaean theodicy, that it's part of nature because it's about development and courage, and that we learn from suffering. So before you go into that exam, be aware of what side you're going to weigh up. Remember, you can always agree with an idea, you can disagree with it, or you can sit on the fence, but you need to sound intelligent when you sit on the fence. So this is not because there are good arguments for and against, but because maybe it's inconclusive, it's unclear. Try and use a term like that.